The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their back confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand that
Well, good morning, America. This is Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. It is February 12th, 2019, and we are today having a special program called Money, Money, and More Money. We're going to be talking about what has happened with our monetary system under the Federal Reserve and what has happened and how they are moving us into a New World Order banking system, a cartel controlled by the same people who have given us this wonderful Federal Reserve System, which is in the process of bankrupting our country. And my special guest is a good friend of mine, a gentleman who he and I served together on the Leadership Council for Freedom Force International, Alan Myers. And Alan is a forensic accountant. He is a certified public accountant out of San Diego, California, and he is a forensic accountant, a forensic auditor who understands how to chase people down rabbit holes to find out just exactly what they're all about. And he has spent the last number of years, 8 or 9 years, studying the Federal Reserve System, studying our government and the way things are run, including the IRS, which is the tax collection agency, the collection agency for the Federal Reserve. And he understands how all this plays out and how it all fits together. And we're going to spend the next 2 hours exposing what our financial system is all about and what we need to do to return our system, the constitutional system that the Founding Fathers tried to give us and that we lived under for at least the first half century of the Republic, and then in various forms up until the Federal Reserve Act was actually signed into law by President Wilson in 1914, which was 105 years ago. So with that, Alan, welcome to the radio show, and thank you for agreeing to come on and talk about this, and we look forward to hear what you have to say.
Oh, I'm thrilled. Thank you for inviting me. Just a couple of clarifications. The Federal Reserve Act was signed by Wilson in December of 1913. In November 1914 is when it went operational, just to be clear on that. So that's why it's called the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. And it turned out to be a very terrible thing for this country. Before we get into a lot of the specifics, I just want to preface all of this with, we're going to be talking today about what I call the fundamental basics of money. This is nothing that's going to require a PhD in economics. You don't need to be a high-flying Wall Street financier. This is just basic information that unfortunately is not out there in our educational system. I also like to bring in a few quotes from our past. I think that it's just very important that we understand this, or that we understand that this has been talked about for a long time by some really important people. So today we're going to be talking about money, what it is, how it's created, who creates it, what's the problem with our system. My first quote is this: money, is the most important subject intellectual persons can investigate and reflect upon. It is so important that our present civilization may collapse unless it is widely understood and its defects remedied very soon. This is a quote from Robert H. Hemphill, credit manager, Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, 1936. The Fed is operational for a little over 20 years, and you've got a credit manager out of the Fed Bank of Atlanta telling you this is the most important topic we can talk about. It kind of sets the framework for it. Any thoughts?
Yeah, Alan, I really appreciate you getting into the history of this because, first of all, we need to understand that the system that we are living under now is designed to have done exactly what it's done, and that is to steal the wealth of the American people and to build a system of 100% credit that does not allow for people to accumulate actual wealth, at least within the confines of the Federal Reserve System. Tell our listeners how that whole thing was set up. We all were good friends with G. Edward Griffin, the gentleman who wrote The Creature from Jekyll Island, and how that whole system was set up to do exactly what we are now doing, and that is force us to lose our independence as a nation and force us to use whatever system of monetary policy that they give us.
Before we get to that, I had a couple of items I wanted to get to set the background, if you don't mind.
No, sure, that's fine. Go ahead, Alan.
But we will be getting to that. As you pointed out, I'm a CPA. I can tell you that in my education, in my education and the education of a lot of other CPAs I know, attorneys, none of this is in there. Not in college, not in post-education. This only comes from digging. And then you bring up Mr. Griffin and The Creature from Jekyll Island. That is the book I started reading a little over 8 years ago. That is the book I woke up in. If I hadn't gotten that book, I probably would not be doing what I'm doing now. But one thing I wanted to share with people is that, listeners, is that the money, this thing that we use, I call it the origin and development of money. Banks didn't create money. Governments didn't create money or the need for it. People did. People way, way back in the day, they were doing what was called direct barter. Apples for oranges, eggs for tomatoes. After a while, as people expanded their trading, they found that this just doesn't work. People developed money to facilitate what I call peaceful, indirect transactions. That's what we do with money. Now, money has many characteristics. However, its main function is to facilitate an indirect transaction. But it didn't come from people. I mean, it didn't come from banks. It didn't come from people. Excuse me, banks or government. It came from people. That is so important.
Okay, Alan, and you're alluding to this right now, but always money was a measure of labor, a measure of one's work, and it didn't matter what you were laboring in, you attached a value to the labor that you were doing, and that became money. And that's the foundation of money, as you say, and that facilitates indirect transactions.
Whether it's services provided or goods provided, you, the service provider, you, the goods provider, come up with a value, and part of that value is what someone else was able to get for it. Again, back in the day, it was direct barter, apples for oranges. That's very time-consuming. That's very awkward, not always very successful. That's why people came up with this concept of today M1's been a good tank, or great tank, and a great rifle, but in what we're talking about today, M1 is the basic supply of money in our system. M standing for money, 1 standing for the number one supply. And this number one supply is money that is considered on demand, spendable now. It has 4 different items in it. It's cash in circulation in country, coin in circulation in country, all the digits in checking accounts, not savings or any other kind of bank account, just checking or demand deposit accounts, and traveler's checks issued by non-banks. For today's discussion, we'll put aside the traveler's checks because it's a very small amount, it's a very small percentage. We'll just deal with cash, coin, and electronic digits and checking accounts. Now, when I say cash in country in circulation, it means the cash that you and I have in our pockets, in our wallets, or our businesses. Same with coin. The digits and checking accounts. That's all M1. That's all considered on demand. Only people, and this is somewhat of a repetitive theme, only people have money in our system. Banks don't have money, M1 money, in their own name. The U.S. government doesn't have it, and the Fed doesn't have it. Only people have M1 money, use M1 money. And to help describe how this happens, now we all know what a dollar is, cash, Federal Reserve note. And you may have heard many times that somebody, some entity, is printing too much money. Well, M1 money is never printed into existence. Let me explain. Our dollar bill, Federal Reserve note, is printed by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. That entity is a bureau of the U.S. Treasury. Now, they charge a per note charge, and they charge the Fed. It's as low as 5.5 cents for a $1 or $2 bill. It's as high as 14.3 cents for a $100 bill. But for the conversation today, let's just think of it as 10 cents a note. There's an entity in the Fed called the Cash Products Office. It places the orders with the Bureau. The Bureau prints the Federal Reserve notes. And sitting on the loading docks of the Bureau, waiting for an armored truck from the Fed to pick it up, they could have millions and millions of street value dollars on those loading docks. But to the Bureau, it's nothing but a printing expense. It would be, Dan, it'd be like you go into your local printer, asking them to print you some flyers. You get there, and there on the counter are your flyers. To your printer, it's just a print job. To the Bureau, all those Federal Reserve notes, street value, millions and millions of dollars, is nothing more than a print job, and they're going to get 10 cents a note. The Fed picks it up, armored truck, takes it back to the Fed bank. Just so you know, when the armored truck gets to the Fed, the doors go up, the truck goes in, engine goes off, the doors go down, everything, truck and all, gets dropped down into the basement to unload all those Federal Reserve notes. Sitting in the vaults of a Federal Reserve Bank could be street value, literally billions of dollars. But to the Fed, the bookkeeping treatment that it does with the street value of billions and billions of dollars in its vault, it's nothing but a printing expense. Just like office supplies or repair and maintenance. It's nothing. It's not money to them. It's just a business expense. The next step of that dollar becoming M1 money, a bank wants it. And of course, banks only want cash because people want cash. To get a Federal Reserve note from the Fed to a bank, the bank has to give up an electronic reserve. That means its reserve account at the Fed goes down, so its electronic reserves go down, which means its physical reserves go up. So all the cash in a bank's vault and teller drawers is not M1 money. It's not considered in circulation. It's simply that bank's reserves in physical form. Final step, step 4. Whether you go to an ATM or you go into the bank and you draw out money from your checking account. Your checking account balance, which is M1, goes down. Your physical M1 money, cash, goes up. Your personal money supply hasn't changed, but now that Federal Reserve note is actually money. In our system, money is never printed into existence. If someone's telling you somebody's printing too much money, they are completely mistaken. Does that all make sense? Dan?
Yeah, Alan, yes, it does. And but I know people have a hard time understanding, the relationship between the Fed and actual money, because of the whole relationship of money being based on debt rather than assets. Maybe if you want to talk about and explain how that works.
Sure. Well, that's ultimately where we were going to get to. I can get to it now, or I can tell you why I think why our current monetary system is so bad. What would you like?
Well, go ahead. You follow how you would like to do this presentation, because you've done it a number of times for a number of different audiences, and I want to give you the freedom to follow the course that you think is best to explain it all.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Again, I just described how the Federal Reserve notes are printed, and they move through the system from the printer to the Fed to the bank to the people. But only when it gets in the hands of the people is that Federal Reserve note considered money, is it considered to be in circulation. Just to give you an idea, there's an economist, John Kenneth Galbraith. He wrote a book, Money, Whence It Came, Where It Went, 1975. This is a quote I pulled from that book. The process by which banks create money is so simple that the mind is repelled. We're going to get to how that actually happens when we get to the journal entries, because this whole system comes down to basically 3 bookkeeping journal entries. But before we do, I want to talk about if you look at something and nothing seems to be wrong, you're going to say to yourself, well, as the old saying goes, if it's not broke, why fix it? And what is wrong with this system is so self-evident if you know where to look or why something is really not good for us and it hurts us. The 3 symptoms of this very diseased monetary system for me, are inflation, federal taxation, and national debt. Inflation is the better way to describe it, because inflation just kind of sounds benign. Inflation is actually loss of purchasing power. When the Fed went operational in November 1914, and I get this from other economists that I've read, $1 had the purchasing power of 100 1914 pennies. Easy. Today's dollar has the purchasing power of 2 1914 pennies. Things are not more expensive today because they're so much more valuable. It's because our dollar buys so much less. Now, what's interesting about this is that one of the mandates of the Federal Reserve System is to maintain a stable dollar unit. Well, or stable prices, I should say. Well, if prices keep going up because the purchasing power of the dollar keeps going down, I would say we don't have stable prices, and that is just one example of the failure of this system. If you have constant, steady inflation, which we've had, the system isn't working for the benefit of the people who use it. And only people use this monetary system because only people have money. Next, because banks are the sole creators of money, well, our federal government has two choices to fund itself, and that is taxation and borrowing. And what I like to say about taxation is it's not profit-making, it's profit-taking. So our government needs to be funded because this system requires it to get its funding from us through taxation. But as we found out, just by looking at the national debt, which is just hovering under $22 trillion, apparently taxation doesn't get the job done. Now, most people, they know the word trillion, but people don't talk about trillion in what I call understandable units. So I want to take a moment and describe a trillion in three what I would call understandable units: seconds, inches, and miles. Let's say, Dan, you had a goal of living 1 trillion seconds. That's your goal. You want to live that long. That's great. You'd have to live 31,709 years. Okay, that's not going to happen. So next you decide you want to get healthy and you want to walk 1 trillion inches. To walk 1 trillion inches, you'd have to walk a distance equal to 633 times around the Earth at the equator. And one lap around the equator, 24,500 miles. Okay, that's not going to happen. So finally, you're an adventuresome type. You decide you want to be the first one to have a 1 trillion-mile frequent flyer card. To do that, you'd have to fly a distance equal to about 107 round trips from Earth to Pluto and back. That's 1 trillion. And our national debt is sitting under just 22 trillion. This debt is unpayable. It can never be paid off under the current monetary system that keeps generating the need to borrow more and more. One of my biggest problems, other than that the national debt is unpayable, the only reason it is serviceable, that is, we can keep redeeming the treasuries and getting more, is because the interest rate's so low. If the interest rate was much higher, at a reasonable rate, we'd be bust. This would be done. But the other thing the two other things that gets me about the national debt is, one, there's this presumption that the federal government can always find one more lender. That's crazy. And two, since the federal government has no profit-making operation or ability, it can never repay its borrowings from profit-making, which means, of course, the national debt is the world's largest public Ponzi scheme. So these are the three things that tell me our monetary system is totally diseased. You've got inflation, you have federal taxation, and you have now monstrously unpayable national debt. And we have basically stuck our country and the future with this unpayable debt. I don't think we've done well for our future.
No, we haven't. And one of the things, Alan, you mentioned the amount of debt, the national debt at $22 trillion, and actually that isn't even touching on the unfunded liabilities of all the things that we've agreed to pay out into the future, which account for somewhere around another $130 trillion that we are indebted to that we don't really understand. And yet at the same time, all these politicians keep talking about giving people free money. Well, there is no such thing as free money.
Thank you for bringing that up. Yes, I totally agree. There's no free money, there's no free lunch. And just a quick offshoot, there's this idea that we, the people of this country, are going to provide a free college education to people. And I'm thinking, just because there's no cost to the consumer in the moment doesn't mean it's free. You don't have professors working for free. You don't have universities, existing for free. They got utilities and supplies and employees. None of this is free. If it's no cost to the consumer, that doesn't mean the whole thing is free. Back to the unfunded liabilities. Thank you for bringing that up. In 2012, an economist out of Boston, Lawrence Kotlikoff, I think I say his name right, he did a present value analysis of the unfunded liabilities. Now, I don't know how he did it, and I don't know what discount rate he used. Anyway, the upshot of it, and this is in 2012, he said that the unfunded liabilities, which is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, was over $200 trillion. Even if you took half of that as a rounding error and said it's $100 trillion, okay, this is monstrous liabilities, as you pointed out, that are owed in the future, and there's no funding currently sitting in any vault to pay for this. But then, if you want to even add more to the debt pile, we got the national debt, we got the unfunded liabilities. Think about all the debts owed by all the 50 states, then all the counties and the cities and the municipalities, and then the people. This is absolutely representative of what is wrong with this system. It creates what amounts to ultimately be unpayable debt. And all this system will do is continue to do the same thing until it finally blows. And when it does, well, the federal government is going to go, wow, we didn't see that coming. Now keep in mind that the Fed itself is private. It is not, the Federal Reserve System, the Federal Reserve banks are not part of the federal government. They are, it's a separate private entity. And I've talked about this in the past, and I'm trying to find a quote that's, this came from regarding a circuit court case. The regional Federal Reserve banks are not government agencies, but are independent, privately owned, locally controlled corporations. Lewis versus the United States, 1982, the Ninth Circuit. So our whole system is allegedly controlled by private corporations. And it actually is, but it's not the one that you're thinking about. Now, there are 12 Federal Reserve Banks in this country. I think there's 7 east of the Mississippi.
Alan, I'm sorry, but I hear the commercial break coming up. Hold that thought, and we'll pick it up on the other side of the break.
Okay. Thank you.
Serving the planet. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and today my guest on the radio program is Alan Myers, and we are talking about money, and more money. And Alan was just in the process of talking about the enormous amount of debt that was created by a system that was not based on assets like our founding fathers envisioned, not a system that was backed by gold and silver, but a system that is based 100% now on credit, and it was sold to us as a system that would stabilize the economy. And what it's actually done is destroy the economy. And we have an enormous amount of growth in our economy, but it's all based on debt. And that is the poison pill that's going to destroy our society if we don't stop this madness and stop it now. So, Alan, I'll get back to you and go ahead and finish your thoughts and continue with what you were talking about.
Thank you, Dan. Just to get back into it, what we had talked about right before the break was that we have $22 trillion, and earlier I described how massive $1 trillion is. We've got $22 trillion in national debt. Potentially we have $100 to $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Then you have all the debts owed by all the states, the counties, the cities, the municipalities, the people, their businesses. We have absolutely more debt in our system than we have money to pay it off. If you could take all the money from everyone and pool it and throw it at all the debt, at the end of the day, there'd be no money in existence anymore, but there'd be still a ton of debt. This system is working perfectly the way it was designed, and it's not designed to work for the benefit of us. You don't create all this unpayable debt by accident. Now, right before the break, we were talking about the Federal Reserve. Just to be clear, the Federal Reserve system is not public. It's not quasi-public. That's like saying a gal is quasi in the family way. No, you either are or you're not. And the Fed is absolutely private. Each bank, there's 12 of them, each Federal Reserve Bank is owned by its member banks within its region. And each one of those banks is a private corporation. They are, as the law calls them, stockholders. If you want to think about this, the Fed is supposed to regulate the banks, but the banks are the owners of the Fed. Another way of saying it, the regulatees own the regulator. This doesn't sound like a system that's really set up for the benefit of the people. But I've gone through this in the past. There are so many indications that the Fed is absolutely private. One of them, or a few of them that I'd like to bring up, is that apparently to audit the Fed, Congress has to pass a law to audit. And when they say audit, they're not talking financial statement audit. They're talking about operational audit. Each Fed bank, the financial statements of each Fed banks, I'm going to say this right eventually, each Fed bank's financial statements are audited by one of the big national accounting firms every year. You can find them on the web as PDFs, and I know because I've found them. So when Dr. Paul and Dr. Paul talk about auditing the Fed, they're talking about its operation, not its financial statements. The Fed refuses to honor Freedom of Information Act requests. You can only do that if you're private, not if you're part of the government. The stockholders, the member banks, receive up to 6% dividend every year based on their capital. That doesn't sound public to me. Not one Fed bank receives any funding from any government. How can you be part of the government if you don't receive funding from it? And the banks, the Fed banks' shares, each of the 12 banks, their shares are so privately held, they're not publicly traded. In fact, only commercial banks can be a member and be a stockholder of a Fed bank, not governments, not people. But this is the one I really like, virtually all or substantially all the employees of each Fed bank and the Board of Governors are covered by a private retirement plan, not the public servant or public civil service plan. This is private. And there's 14 employers in this multi-employer plan. You got the 12 banks, you got the Board of Governors, and the 14th employer is actually the plan administrator. This retirement system or plan is so closed that they've even included the plan administrator in it. This is not public at all. The short of it is, the Fed is private, and it controls, or it has the ability to control, the money supply in our country, the interest rate, how much debt's out there. And to give you an idea of how important this is, I'll give you a little quote. Who controls the money controls the world. Henry Kissinger, 1995, Council on Foreign Relations. So the problem is our system is controlled by corporations, whether it's the Fed banks themselves or the member banks. And we know in this country, corporations are operated for one reason and one reason only, to benefit their stockholders. It's not operated for our benefit. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, Alan, and I want you to really kind of explain to our listeners how the debt-based system operates and the way the Fed has managed and manipulated that to really create the kind of situation we're in now, and why the government's gone along with it.
I won't be able to speak to why the government has gone along with it, other than I would say that the vast majority of people don't really understand how banking works. Because I hear a lot of things. I'm much more attuned now to what people say or what's written. As I mentioned before, for example, when people or I've read, it says that the Fed or the government or whatever is printing too much money. Well, money is never printed into existence, as we talked earlier. What banking comes down to are bookkeeping journal entries. That's it. That's how complicated banking really is. And to give you an idea before we, and I've got some really good authority on this, but let me take you back, and then we'll get into the banking. But I want you to understand how the Fed actually works. Now, back in 2000, or after 2008, we had a little problem. You might recall that. And the Fed jumped in. And this is according to a presentation made by Ben Bernanke, March 29, 2012, to the students, George Washington University School of Business. And this is the fourth of 4 hourly lectures. And in it, he's talking about that the Fed went out into the marketplace to acquire $2 trillion worth of treasuries. That's a lot of treasuries. Finally, I'm reading from the transcript of what he said. This is what Ben Bernanke said, March 2012. Now, you might ask the question, well, the Fed is going out and buying $2 trillion of securities. Well, how do we pay for that? And the answer is that we paid for those securities by crediting the bank accounts of the people who sold them to us. And those accounts at the bank showed up as reserves that the bank would hold with the Fed. So the Fed is a bank for the banks. What Bernanke is describing is that a bank account, or for banks it's a reserve account, that shows up as a liability on their balance sheet. And what the Fed did is make one journal entry. Let's say it acquired all $2 trillion and let's say I'm the Fed for a moment, and Dan, you're the Bank of Dan, and you know I'm looking for treasuries, and you come into my office, and you dump a bunch of paper on my desk. I know what you're doing. You know what I'm going to do. I go to my computer. I put my fingers on the keys. I make one journal entry into my accounting system. I hit enter. And what I've done is I've increased on my books, the Fed books, the asset U.S. Treasuries, and I've credited or increased your reserve account at my Fed bank. That's it. Done. I, the Fed, just acquired $2 trillion worth of interest-bearing debt obligations of U.S. government by making one journal entry. Done. This is how the Fed operates. In fact, well, actually, this is the only way the Fed operates, because the Fed literally, by definition, does not have any money, M1. It doesn't have any reserves. It doesn't need reserves because it creates reserves by simply increasing some bank, some institution's reserve account. When I first saw this, it really totally stunned me. The Fed can acquire any asset, and it can satisfy any expense by doing nothing more than creating reserves. And this is the head of our system. This was very important to me because it led me to what I learned about banking. Any questions on that?
No, and I'm going to add, while we're still talking about this, the reason that government is such a willing, let's say, complicit actor in this process is because politicians can spend money they don't have. They can create programs and play Santa Claus with borrowed money that they don't have, and it allows them to get reelected. And that's the key for politicians, is continue to get reelected so that you can pad your own nest. Now, okay, back to what you were talking about, Alan. No question about everything you said.
I just want to respond. I like what you said, and I do agree that I won't say 100% of them, but apparently the vast majority of these people, especially in D.C., their focus is keeping their name on the door, keeping their job, not doing their job. And so I do agree with you. And as long as they, I guess, play ball, keep it going, they think they're going to be okay. And since they get to do, the people in the House and the Senate get to do what put Martha Stewart in jail, which is insider trading, they're okay with that. I mean, it shows to the level that we, the people, have not controlled, and I call these people in D.C., I call them elected employees. We're the citizen owners. They're the employees, and we've let our elected employees go rogue. This is on us, and this is another thing that has to be changed. If somebody out in the public can go to jail for doing insider trading. Why are these people above the law? I don't get it. Anyway, back to so the Fed is private. The Fed acquires all assets, satisfies all expenses by creating reserves. In fact, if you look at what's called the Financial Accounting Manual, it's the Financial Accounting Manual for all the banks, in it is what's called a chart of accounts. The chart of accounts is a list of all the different accounts that would be in its general ledger. The assets, the liabilities, the equity, the income, the expenses, all of them. Typically, the first asset listed on somebody's or a business's chart of accounts would be cash in bank or petty cash. Well, not one Fed bank has a bank account in its own name. It has no money. They use no money. They need no money because Fed banks create reserves. So now we get to what I talked about earlier. We get to banking. Well, banks are kind of like the Fed in that banks are the sole creators of money in our system. The Fed doesn't create money, doesn't have money. The government doesn't create money, it doesn't have any. Only banks create money. And this is where we get to bookkeeping. Simple, basic bookkeeping. Now, the journal entries I'm going to describe as best I can are what I call intra-bank. They're the whole transaction's taking place within the bank. If you had another bank involved, the net effect would be the same. It just gets a little bit more complicated. The first one is money creation. Now, when you go in to get a loan, the banks don't loan you money that already exists. They create the money that they loan you. And if you don't mind, Dan, I will be the bank and you can be the borrower. And you come into me and you want to borrow some money. And I say, okay. I make one journal entry into my accounting system. I create an asset called loan to Dan. It can be, we'll just call it 100. And I credit a checking account, Dan's checking account. $100 debit, $100 credit. And since the checking account is part of M1, which we talked about earlier, and there's no offsetting decrease anywhere else in the system or in my bank, I, the Bank of Allen, just created money for you. And I'll make any claims on that money good. That is how money is created in our system. And only banks can create money. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense, Alan. And please continue, because I think what you're doing is painting a picture that just about anybody can understand.
Good. Well, there's been a lot of misconception, and people talk about banks loan out of their reserves. They don't. They loan money out they already have. They don't. Banks loan money by creating it and then handing it out. If you and I, if I came to you, Dan, and said I need $20, you give me $20. Well, that's a loan between people of money that's already in existence. Banks only loan money that they just created. Now the next journal entry I want to talk about is it's time to make a loan payment. I'll get to that. Now, have you heard the term, you've heard the term money creation, I believe. Have you heard the term money extinguishment?
Yes, I have, but okay. I'm sure a lot of our listeners haven't. Okay.
Money is created. Money, which means it comes into existence, it's usable. Money gets extinguished. Just because it's not that once money is created, it's always there. It's not. And this is where the second journal entry comes in. It's time to make the loan payment. And I want to use an example that I've got. If you take a regular loan, and let's say it's a me, it's somewhat regular. Let's say it's a $300,000 loan, and the interest rate's 5%, nothing too heavy, and the monthly payment's going to be around $1,610 a month. Well, on the first go-round, when you make that payment, you're going to write me a check for $1,600. That means your checking account is going to go down by $1,600. Well, there's not going to be any increase in any other checking account in the system or in my bank. That means money has been extinguished. So I'm going to extinguish, by you writing me a check on this note, of $1,600. In round numbers, $1,300 is going to be interest, and $300 is going to be principal. Which means the amount you owe me just went down $300, but of the money I originally created, I extinguished $1,600. You're now short $1,300, and this is the first loan payment. We do this enough times, you can see how our money supply would run out. And and this is what's going to lead into the third journal entry I'm going to talk about. Just to give you an idea how rapidly your $300,000 goes away. Well, in a little over 15 years between principal and interest on a $300,000 loan at 5%, you would pay me $300,000 in a little over 15 years. But you still have 14 plus years to pay, which means you're going to pay me another $280,000. So to borrow $300,000 for 30 years at 5%, you will pay almost $280,000 in interest. You might wonder, where is all this money coming from if, Alan, if you're correct, all this money is being extinguished so quickly? Well, this is where we get to journal entry 3. And remember, I'm a bank, and I create money. Now, just as an aside, I don't know if you or your listeners ever watched the TV show Star Trek: The Next Generation. I did. It was a lot of fun. Well, anyway, the captain of the Enterprise, Captain Picard, he'd be in his ready room, and there in the wall is what they called a replicator. A replicator looks like a microwave oven built into a wall without a front door. And he could go up to it and say, "Computer, tea Earl Grey hot," and there it would be. The cup, the saucer, the tea bag, heated to perfection. Well, if you have a replicator, you don't just make tea, you can make any kind of item you want, as long as you can program it in. That's the beauty of a replicator. The banks have a replicator for creating money. It's called fingertips on the keyboard, hit enter. And that's what they do. To support what I'm about to say, I'm going to read to you from an article, first quarter 2014, from 3 authors out of the Bank of England's Monetary Analysis Directorate. Yeah, get that, MAD. And the title of this piece is Money Creation in the Modern Economy. And the article explains how the majority of money in the modern economy is created by commercial banks making loans. Well, in the conclusion, which is very short, it says banks create money whenever they lend to someone in the economy, which we just talked about, or buy an asset from a consumer. These are some of the most amazing words I've ever read, if you can understand it. What they just said, these are 3 people out of the Bank of England, the Monetary Analysis Directorate, 2014, and they say in print that banks create money when they buy an asset from consumers, consumers being people in the marketplace. Well, journal entry for that is debit an asset, credit a checking account. That's money creation. But we thought banks only create money when they fund loans. Not true. In fact, banks create money no matter what they do. The Bank of England is telling you when they buy assets, what they left out is that banks create money when they satisfy expenses also. For example, I'm still the Bank of Allen. Dan, you're an employee. You're a good employee, by the way. And it's payday. And being the bank I am, I give all my employees a free checking account. So it's payday time. And at the end of the day,
Alan, I don't want to break you at a bad spot, but we're going into our commercial break. Keep that whole thought for the other side of the break.
You got it. Thanks.
Was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their back confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and today my guest on the radio program is Alan Myers. Alan is a forensic accountant. He's a CPA out of San Diego, and he has developed a terrific program to identify what our monetary system and what our money policy is all about, and what we can do to make it work to our advantage by eliminating some of the things that have happened to us over the past 105 years. And Alan, we'll get into solutions toward the end of the program. I do want to mention to our listeners how important it is that you support this radio program and this radio network. We've got great programming on this network, and we can't function without your help and support in making these programs available. That means that occasionally you have to get out the checkbook and use some of this checkbook money that Alan's talking about to try to help fund some of the programs that we're doing, including satellite, some of the things that we're trying to do with that. So please get out that checkbook and support this radio network and support this radio program. Okay, Alan, you were talking about your employees, and as the Bank of Allen, you were going to be creating some money to give to your employees who are good employees. Go ahead with that.
Okay, just a real quick one. You just used the term checkbook money. That is actually, and you probably know it, is actually a prior functional term for all the electronic digits in a checking account. That's what it was called, checkbook money, and therefore all the cash in your pocket was called pocketbook money. I'd like to read two quotes, and then we're going to get into it. And this speaks to just how bad the Federal Reserve is and how bad the federal government is. Both these quotes come from Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman said, in part, The Federal Reserve definitely caused the Great Depression by contracting the amount of currency in circulation by 1/3 from 1929 to 1933. Milton Friedman, Nobel Prize-winning economist, says the Fed definitely caused the Great Depression, and it's still running the show. Regarding the federal government, Milton Friedman said, if you put the federal government in charge of the Sahara Desert, in 5 years there'd be a shortage of sand. Apparently not a real fan of either.
Alan, I also want to use that comment to also mention the fact that in 1933, in April of 1933, newly elected President Franklin Delano Roosevelt eliminated the right of Americans to own gold. And he did that because at that point in time, gold was the only thing underpinning our economy, and there were runs on banks, and they were taking all the gold out of the banks. And at that point, he knew the jig was up, and so he made it illegal for Americans to own gold. And in that, he facilitated the final, I'll say, the final steps in screwing our citizens out of their rightful wealth.
Yeah, think about that. He's just become president, and this is, I still don't get this. With an executive order, this is like a CEO telling a company what's going to happen. With not a law passed by Congress signed by the president, but with nothing more than an executive order, the people had less than a month to turn in all their gold, or virtually all their gold, or be subject to fine and imprisonment. This is on an executive order. But I think one of the reasons it was allowed, it happened and was allowed to be enforced, it gives you the mindset of the country at that time. These people are in the heart of the Great Depression. People have lost farms, ranches, businesses, jobs, everything. People are standing in bread lines to get food when this is the worst thing for them, to actually ask for a handout. And we can now credit this situation to the Fed, at least according to Milton Friedman, Nobel Prize-winning economist. So where we left off was previously I talked about the Bank of England, the Monetary Analysis Directorate, where they, in their conclusion to about a 12-page article called Money Creation in the Modern Economy, they state plainly that banks create money when they buy an asset from a consumer. This is just a journal entry. They're increasing the money supply. There's no decrease anywhere else. Well, if you can increase the money supply by acquiring an asset, you can increase the money supply by satisfying accept. And that's where we left off. On the Bank of Allen, Dan, your wonderful employee, it's payday time, and most banks offer their employees free checking accounts. Well, at the end of the day, all you care about as the employee is that your checking account balance went up by your net check. That would be a credit entry. The debit entry, of course, goes to wage expense. Key that in, hit enter, it's done. Your money supply, your M1 money supply, your checking account just went up. There's no offsetting decrease anywhere in my bank or in the system. I, the Bank of Allen, just created money by satisfying an expense. Here's the kicker. I'm a bank. For tax purposes, I'm treated as a regular corporation, which means I file regular tax returns. And I deduct expenses on my tax returns that I never have, will, or can pay for, because I have no money. I create money. I've got the replicator. It's called a computer. It's called keyboard. Now, does that sound fair to you? Dan? That I get to create money for whatever expense I need to satisfy, and then I get a reduced taxable income by using that expense. So when people say money is only created by debt, they don't understand this third journal entry. If money was only created by debt, this system would have collapsed a long time ago, because, as we talked about with journal entry 2, there's so much money being extinguished every time you make a loan payment, the system would run out. The only way this system can continue to resupply the money supply is that banks are creating money when they acquire assets and satisfy expenses. Notice I don't say the word pay, because they don't pay. You and I pay. We go out of pocket. Our money supply goes down. Banks, no. They just create more money. Thoughts on that?
Well, as a matter of fact, I've got a very, very good friend who is a retired banker. He was I guess he was the executive vice president of Wells Fargo Banks out in the Portland, Oregon area. He's also a retired brigadier general with the Oregon National Guard. And he went with me to one of my programs on money, banking, and the Federal Reserve. And at that program, I talked about many of the things that you were talking about here. And the program's about an hour long. At that hour, I said, Fred, how did you like the program? He said, Dan, I learned more about banking and the Federal Reserve System in the last hour than I learned in 40 years of banking and being actively involved in the system. That tells you that there are an awful lot of people who are well up on the food chain that don't really understand just exactly how bad the system is.
Exactly. You would think that if you were in the system, in the banking system, and as you said, very high up on the food chain, you would have complete knowledge of this. You'd have complete understanding of it. But somehow, it's not there. You know, and an example of that, excuse me a second, an example of that would be a race car driver who's an absolutely fabulous race car driver, but knows nothing about actually building or maintaining the car. They don't know how it works. They just know where the gears are, they know where the brake is, they know where the accelerator is, they know how to steer it. That's it. And I've talked to people in banking in my area. And one of my favorite questions used to be, what do you know about the Federal Reserve System? And you ask that to most people, and they just stare at you. They have no answer. To me, and I was going to say this in the beginning, the monetary system is the most important, powerful system in our country. And I don't say that dismissing or diminishing any of the other huge problems we have in this country, but I say it because everything is connected to, through, by, or with our monetary system. Nothing escapes its power and its influence. This makes it the number one thing in our system, and the vast majority of people, their financial literacy on this topic is nil. Gee, I wonder if that was by design. So what we've talked about is 3 journal entries. How money is created, how it's extinguished, and then again, how it's created. When a loan payment is made, so much money is extinguished that after a while, if the only way to create money was to fund more loans, you'd eventually run out of money. But banks, no. They create money when they acquire assets, according to the Bank of England, which also would lead to the conclusion, they create money when they satisfy expenses. This is probably in part why we have inflation. They're constantly pumping more money into the system than is being acknowledged. And to me, this is an area I haven't studied, but my understanding is that any bank is limited in creating money by the Federal Reserve requirement. You can only have so many loans outstanding based on your reserves. But a bank could be fully loaned up, that is, based on their reserves. They can't create any more, they can't make any more loans, but they can still create money, pump it into the supply by acquiring assets and satisfying expenses, which really shows the power of money creation. What you can do when that power, when you understand who holds that power, you can see what they can do. The fact that they may be breaking tax laws by deducting expenses that they never can, will, or have to pay for, that's another thing. And this leads me to, okay, this is the system. This is the way it really operates. How can we change this, or what would the system be that would actually benefit the people in our country versus private banks? Well, we still need money creation. And I do try to envision simple solutions. To this point, in June of 2018, there was this is just backdrop information. In June of 2018, in Switzerland, arguably the home of international banking, they had a national referendum called the Sovereign Monetary Initiative. Now, chances are most people never heard of this. Have you heard of it, Dan?
Yeah, actually I have, and I've heard of a couple other things, but I'm waiting for you to go ahead and tell our listeners.
Great. To get a national referendum in Switzerland takes a couple of years, 2-3 years to finally get it. But it goes up for a national vote. And the Sovereign Monetary Initiative had some far-reaching aims, but its number one was to take the power to create money away from the banks and return it to their Swiss National Bank. Think about that. In the home, arguably the home of international banking, they have a national vote to take the power to create money away from banks. I never saw it on one mainstream media outlet. And most of the people that I encounter, they've never heard of it. This is absolutely huge. Now, it did fail dramatically, and I believe it failed because they didn't explain as well as I think they could have what would be the benefits. But the sheer fact that it made a national vote in Switzerland tells me this is a really valid idea. To take the power to create money away from banks. We still need banks. I'm not anti-bank. I'm not anti-bank employee or bank buildings. We need the system. All I want is to take that power to create money away from the banks and return it to the benefit of the people. Because, as we started out, only people have news money. Only people created the concept of money, not banks or governments. This rightfully belongs to us. This is not us taking something that we're greedy about. This is our money supply. People rightfully get to own, control, direct their money supply. And the way I envision it is, right now, I call it the national bank. The national bank's main job is to create funding to fund the federal government based on approved budgets, which means the federal government would get all the funding it needs based on approved budgets. We, the people, have to make sure they're not doing crazy stuff, which is our job anyway, which means the federal government would not have to levy a tax anymore to operate, which means the IRS goes away. It also means that it wouldn't need to borrow anymore, which means we could pay down the debt. This is the highest and best use of money creation in a country where the people are going to act in a united way, in a united benefit. We take all that power, we focus it, and we use it to fund our necessary federal government. No more taxation at the federal level, no more borrowing, and because the money supply could be controlled to match the economic level, we're not going to have inflation. The three serious symptoms of a totally diseased monetary system, inflation, federal income taxation, and national debt, could be eliminated. And yeah, we can do this. To get this done, we have to tell, and I call them, I think I've said this, I call them the elected employees, because that's what they are. They're in D.C. And we are the citizen owners. We tell our employees, no more, no more. And to get this done would take maybe 10 minutes a day. You send 3 emails, you make 3 phone calls, maybe you go visit their local or state office also, and demand that the power to create money is taken from banks and returned to the benefit of the people. The other thing that's really advantageous about this kind of system is, let's say, God forbid, of course, we have some really big national disasters. Hurricanes, tornadoes, whatever. Really big. Well, we as a united country want to help our sister states and the people in those states. So we would want the federal government to go out there and help, which means you're going to need a lot of extra emergency funding. The National Bank could create that funding, but to prevent it from becoming inflationary by staying out into the economy too long, that extra money could be sales taxed out by the National Bank until the money supply is level with the economic conditions, then the sales tax goes away. So you have the ability to create emergency funding, and you have the ability to reduce that emergency funding so it doesn't become inflationary. All of this is for the benefit of the people and our country. We are no longer indebted to the way we are, because our national debt, as we talked about earlier, is $22 trillion. Forget the unfunded liabilities of $100 to $200 trillion. That $22 trillion is unpayable. You can't fix this unpayable situation by maintaining the same monetary system. We have to change. And currently, this is my idea of how to change it.
Alan, one of the things that the federal government and the Federal Reserve System have done, and they are in collusion with one another, let's face it. The federal government likes the Federal Reserve because they can borrow money, basically, that they don't have, lay it on the taxpayer in future liabilities, and then play Santa Claus. And I think average citizens in this country, one of the biggest things that we need to do is realize that there's no such thing as free money, and realize that every dime that goes into creation for some phony program that they want to call free money is actually that much more debt, and it will destroy the future generations' opportunity to be prosperous.
Well, absolutely. To that point, I'd like to read a quote from Thomas Jefferson. This was in a letter, an 1816 letter to John Taylor, who was in Congress. And I sincerely believe with you that banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies, and that the principle of spending money to be paid by posterity, that's the future, under the name of funding, is but swindling futurity on a large scale. Okay, I'm reminded of that, if you remember the movie Top Gun, and the bald guy's named Stinger, and he's dressing down Tom Cruise's Maverick, and he's saying, your ego's writing checks your body can't cash. Well, when you keep spending funds that you don't have, but you only acquired through borrowing, and you're basically telling the future, you have to pay for what I'm going to consume now, that's a fraud.
Alan, it's absolutely a fraud, and the thing is, as a former elected official myself, I can tell you that certainly local governments they'll say, well, it's free money. And you say, no, it's not free money. There's no such thing as free money. Anything that you spend now will it will affect future generations.
Right.
And I think of all these stupid bike trails and all this crap that we are funding with so-called free money, and nobody wants to hear it. Nobody wants to understand that what they're doing is selling their children into slavery.
Yeah, I call it debt service slavery, and a little tongue-in-cheek, there is free money. Free money is when Grandma gives you some money, on your birthday. That's free money. But when you are a government entity, you are either taxing or borrowing the funding. And as every government entity out there is able to state, we cannot tax enough to provide all that we've promised to provide for you, or we want to provide for you, so we have to borrow. And up till now, you've always been able to find one more lender. Well, what happens when you can't find any more lenders? I'm thinking about this at the national level, and right now, probably every public-private pension plan out there is underfunded, seriously underfunded. They don't have enough to complete or meet all the promises they've made. But like good pension plans, a good amount of their funds have been invested in treasuries because they had to, because it's AAA rated, totally secure. And a lot of these pension plans, or most of them, they need a 6 to 8% return on investment to keep up with what's going on. Well, they're nowhere near that. So they're seriously underfunded. They're totally dependent on getting those treasuries when they come due to fund them. Well, what happens if the federal government, or when the federal government has to default in part? Because it can no longer find any more lenders in the world, because the rest of the world is really hurting, and they're cashing in their treasuries when they can, and they're not buying new ones. Well, you can see what's going to happen. People on Social Security are going to get hammered. People are waiting for their pension payment. They're going to get hammered because the pensions won't have the funding. This is all hanging in the balance. It's like being on it was the RMS Titanic. Very sad story, but they didn't change course, and they steamed right into the ice fields. And we know what happened. Well, we're on the USA Titanic, and we need to change course, because we are steaming towards the ice fields. And if we don't change course, if we don't take control of our monetary system, we're going to hit another iceberg. And on that one, on the RMS Titanic, approximately only 1/3 of the passengers and crew got off that ship alive. 2/3 went down with the ship. This is what's coming, and this is, to me, this is not something, way in the future. Okay, well, I'm going to stiff my grandchildren, but okay, that's okay with me. No, it's not that far out. Because if you look at what's going on in the rest of the world, and of note, China, especially as it relates to the U.S., is starting to tell its people, its investors, its conglomerates, start selling your stuff in the U.S. and bring the money home, because China is going through an economic slowdown and they need the funding in their country. So there's a big contraction coming. Mm-hmm. And then you've got, of course, Deutsche Bank, 15th largest bank in the world, biggest bank in Germany, and it has, 40 to 60 trillion dollars of derivatives on its books. Derivative being basically a bet, gambling. Mm-hmm. It's not an investment in an asset. It's a bet on whether an asset will go up in value or down in value. Okay, Deutsche Bank is a casino that cannot make good on all its bets. So you can imagine what the fallout that's going to happen when they finally blow. And back in, I think it was December, they got raided their Frankfurt office got raided because they have been doing a little money laundering.
Alan, a great discussion. Let's hold your thoughts for the other side of the break, and then let's pick up with that and what we can do to change the system.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and today my guest on the radio show is Alan Myers, and Alan is giving us a really good background and understanding of what our whole financial system is based on and what our money system is all about. And Alan, you mentioned derivatives. We've had several programs talking about the $1.3 quadrillion derivatives bubble that is out there that was really what caused the financial crisis in 2008 and led to the bailout of our system. And incidentally, we bailed out a lot more than the $753 billion that most of the people heard about. We actually bailed out somewhere around somewhere in the neighborhood of $28 trillion in derivatives. And for a time, the biggest purchaser of U.S. Treasuries was the Federal Reserve System itself. So, as I like to tell our listeners, it's like you get thrown in jail for writing a bad check, and your wife comes to the jail and bails you out with a bad check, and that's basically what we a long time.
Well, on the derivative topic, what in part what led to the problem is that AIG was one of the big players. There's a thing called a credit default swap. Now, in its true proper form, a credit default swap is really just investment insurance. And it makes perfect sense. If I'm out there, I'm running a big company, I've got millions and millions, tens of millions to invest to make something, and I go out and buy some corporate bond, well, I'm not going to make that kind of investment without having some insurance. That's what a credit default swap was meant to be. So I'm going to pay a certain premium per month, per year, while I hold these bonds. And it makes sense. That's not a problem. That's just insurance. The problem happened with AIG is they started selling credit default swaps to anyone who would buy them, which means you're buying insurance on something that you don't own. Now, we all understand that to get insurance, you have to have an insurable interest. I can get insurance on my house, but Dan, I can't get fire insurance on your house. I don't have an insurable interest. Yet AIG was allowed by the system to sell investment insurance to people who didn't have one penny invested in what was being insured. This is what ultimately led to the big blow-up of 2008, at least in part. And now the derivatives market is even greater.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's say, Dan, you're a casino owner, and I come in and I'm a big gambler, big whale, and you know that I'm about to lay down a bet, a huge bet, that based on the odds, if I win, you cannot pay. Are you going to let me place that bet? No way.
Mm-hmm.
Can't, because you're going to lose your casino. You're not going to bet the odds that you're going to win because you'd lose your business. But our financial systems, national and international, have allowed banks, financial institutions to basically engage in gambling to a level that cannot be covered. Okay, these systems are operated for the moment. They're not operated for the long term. This is a huge problem, and this is why people need to take back their monetary systems, because it is only people, as we talked about earlier, it's only people that have, use, hold, spend money. Banks don't have money in their own name, federal government doesn't, and the Fed doesn't. So we need to bring this back. And to a point that you made earlier, another quote from Thomas Jefferson, it's incumbent on every generation to pay its own debts as it goes. Boy, isn't that odd?
Mm-hmm.
A principle which, if acted on, would save 1/2 the wars of the world. Thomas Jefferson. I think he knew a little bit about history. And last one, to how powerful debt is, or how powerful it can be. This is from John Adams, another president of the United States. There's 2 ways to conquer and enslave a nation. Note those 2 words, conquer and enslave. There's 2 ways to conquer and enslave a nation. One is by the sword, the other by debt. We are being conquered by debt because the people do not own and control their own monetary system. What do? The key point that we need to take back is the power, the ability, and the benefit that comes from money creation. Since only people have, hold, use, spend money, this part of the system needs to belong to the people. To do that, we have to do in part what the Swiss tried to do with the Sovereign Monetary Initiative, take the ability to create money away from banks. As I said earlier, I'm not anti-bank employee, or anti-bank building. No, we still need them. And take the power and the benefit that comes from money creation, put it into an entity that benefits the people in our country. And to get this done, we the people have to do what we have not been doing for so long. We have to start telling the people in D.C. and anywhere else what needs to get done and when, which is now. That is, repeal the Federal Reserve Act and all their amendments, take control of the Fed. Since the Fed helped create this mess, the Fed's going to help clean it up. And to me, whatever treasuries is held on the Fed's books, that is debt owed by the U.S. government, that's just going to go to vapor. It's not going to be paid. And we need to run the Fed until we can get, at least my idea, is a national bank up and running, ready to go, create the funding. Banks still operate. And now, when they make a loan, they're going to make a loan out of their own hide. They don't get to create the money. And when they pay their employees, they're going to have to pay it out of their own hide, not create the money. We can get it done, but we have to want it done, and we have to feel the pressure that actually exists. Right now, most people don't. They just pass off inflation, loss of purchasing power if it's nothing. We've come to expect that you have to pay federal tax. If you don't, you're not a good citizen. And national debt, well, that just happens. No. None of these 3 things need to happen, and they're absolute signs of a very dysfunctional monetary system. People need to unite individually, in groups, make the phone calls to your elected employees in D.C., send the emails once a day to each of them. Go to their offices if they're local or in-state. You could also pester your state elected employees to see where they stand on this issue. This is a national issue. This is our children, for those old enough to have children. Our children, our grandchildren, our country's future is at stake. Just as John Adams said, conquered and enslaved. Conquered and enslaved by debt. Right now, we are what I call debt service slaves. We are here to service the debt. And when it can no longer be serviced, think about what happened during the Great Depression. how much power was given to the federal government because people were so without. Well, the next round is going to make the Great Depression look like a picnic. That's my worry.
Alan, I agree with exactly what you're saying, and I have to tell you that that is a worry to me too, because we had a fairly independent country and had a lot of really good solid citizens during the Great Depression, and we have turned into such a soft and needy society that thinks that somehow they're owed something for nothing, and they're very, very quick to jump on the welfare bandwagon or whatever they need to do. And I don't think there's any question, certainly not in my mind, that this whole house of cards, this whole Ponzi scheme, was created so that government and big government, world government, could control everyone from cradle to grave and control everything they do, and that this is actually just part of a much bigger plan to make us slaves forever and do it through a debt system that they control, and it's a one world banking system, and it'll be totally digital, and there'd be no way that we would know just exactly how it happened.
Well, to that point, you're talking about and I agree with what you're saying. There's a push, especially in Scandinavia, Norway, Denmark, Sweden. These countries are well on the way to becoming fully cashless. No physical money. In fact, I've seen pictures of signs and windows of businesses in Sweden. If the translation is to believe, it just says no cash. Well, a lot of people think this is fabulous. Look at all the costs that are going to be saved of creating physical money. No more dirty stuff, and I can do everything with my phone, and we're really techie. Okay, here's the problem. And SEAL team, our great SEAL team, would say 2 is 1, 1 is none. Well, when you only have one form of money and it's all electronic, that means all your monetary wealth is controlled by banks. In a computer that you don't know where it is, you have no direct access, you only have indirect. You are dependent on that indirect access. You can be cut off at any time. Just think about Cyprus and Greece. And, wait a minute. We're dependent on electricity and internet access. Gee, what could go wrong? The other thing is that and this is one of the pushes. See, if all money is electronic, then you don't have, in essence, national money. You don't have the dollar, you don't have the euro, you don't have the krona or whatever. So it becomes less of a national thing, and now it becomes more of an international thing. One world order. We're all widgets coming off an assembly line. Well, when you have all electronic money, no physical, it is going to be very easy to implement what's called negative interest. Now, this negative interest is out there in Europe right now, and the Fed's talking about it. Negative interest, for those who may not know, is when you put $1 in the savings account, you expect to get, $1.05 at the end of the year. No, you're going to get 95 cents. So they're going to charge you. They're saying there's no time value to savings. And if you decide, well, I'm going to escape this by moving my money to my checking account, well, fine. Your checking account's going to get hammered with higher fees. This is just another way of taking wealth from people. But when it's all electronic, you can't put money aside, in your sock drawer, underneath the pit bull's doghouse. You got no place to put it because there's no physical money. And one of the arguments against people who actually take money out of the system physically and put it somewhere for a rainy day, people like that are called hoarders. See, you're hoarding money out of the system. This is bad. You're evil. We need to go fully electronic. Well, this just screams failure. Again, look at what's happened in Greece and Cyprus. Look at what's happening in Venezuela today. You want to stand in line for an hour or two just to get $100, $200 out of your account? Because that's all they're going to give you? This makes us even more dependent.
No, absolutely. And Alan, I have to put this into the mix too. People like you and me who are railing against the system and talking about how the bankers are destroying our future for our kids and our grandkids. We're going to be labeled enemy of the state, and when it's fully electronic, they can just cut everything off, and we're done. We literally will starve to death.
To that point, I saw a report some time ago. On average, Social Security Administration declares 1,000 people dead a month that aren't dead. Well, when you're declared dead, and you're not, you have a really hard time accessing your bank account, credit, anything, because the system says you're dead. And it's going to take you months of face-to-face interaction with Social Security to convince them you're not dead. So if that happens by an accident, imagine when it's deliberate. And this kind of goes to what's going on in China as they're developing this social credit score. And this is right hand in hand with all their surveillance activity and facial recognition and everything else. Well, if you do anything like speak out against the government, well, your social credit score is going down, which means you may not, if you don't have a good enough score, well, you don't get to ride the train, you don't get to fly on a plane, you don't get to leave the country, you may have to live somewhere else. All of this is to intensify the collective power, which is going to make human beings, which we are never intended to be nothing more than widgets off an assembly line. Again, back to John Adams, conquered and enslaved by debt. We are well on the process of having this happen. It can be stopped. It must be stopped. And it's on us right now. The beauty thing to me is that it is so simple to fix this. 3 emails, 3 phone calls every day. Hammer the people in D.C. Get this done or don't come home. It's on us. It's our time. It's our time. Okay, back in the 40s, we know what that generation did. They stepped up like nobody ever. And they stuffed tyranny into a box. They won World War II on both fronts. Well, it's time now for this generation to step up. This is our call to action. We are facing tyranny. We are facing total economic control of our lives. It's time for us to act. And we don't have to put on a uniform. We don't have to sling a rifle. We can do it with phone calls and emails. And, this is what I want to share with people.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not asking anybody to climb Everest. You can do this from your home, in your jammies. 3 phone calls, 3 emails.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then when you got time, talk to your family, talk to your neighbors, talk to your friends, talk to your coworkers. Get them awake, get them involved. We've all got skin in this game.
The ultimate skin in this game, Alan, and that is what people need to understand, is that if we don't act on our own behalf, in our own self-interest, and turn this ship around, we will lose everything. And I want, we're getting toward the end of the program, and I want to give you an opportunity to talk about the 16 module program that you put together to educate people on the financial system and educate people so that they can talk with others about what's going on. And Alan, tell our listeners, first of all, anything you want to share with them, but also how they can contact you to learn more about this whole Ponzi scheme.
Thank you very much. I saw the blast you put out yesterday, so on that you put my name, email, phone number, so they can contact me that way. I produced something called Fed Ed, Fed being Federal Reserve System, Ed being education. And it actually includes 18 modules. The first 15 are one-pagers. 16 is 3 pages, and it describes the journal entries. 17 is a one-pager, and 18 is 3 pages of quotes I really like. It was written to take somebody who, number one, it's not technical. It's basically the way I've spoken today, or we've chatted today. And it takes somebody from the beginning, the origin and history of money, all the way to the journal entries. It gives the reader just simple information. There's so many modules because I've broken each topic into one page, which means, if you spend, read a page a day, you're almost done in 2 weeks. It's not, and it gets the person to be very financial system literate in a short period of time. You can send an email to me, contact me. If you know people or groups who want to hear this information, please contact me. I'm trying to get out and speak more because, as I said, 8 years ago I was totally asleep. I got The Creature from Jekyll Island. I can't tell you where on the pages of that book I woke up, but it is within those pages I did wake up. I care about my country. I care about its future. I care about the future generations, and I realize this is all on us. So please contact me if you have interest in this, or if you have specific questions. You can just send me an email. Reference Connecting the Dots and Dan Happel, and we'll get communicating. But it's so surprisingly simple, the solution. What gets me is that none of this is generally out there, and it's taking people like you, Dan, and myself to get it out there, to wake people up so they see that there really is a problem and that there really is a solution.
Mm-hmm. Well, Alan, I have to thank you for being our guest today, and I hope people will contact Alan and get his information to as many people as you can. And his contact, for those who don't receive our letter, is the letter AMCPA53 at gmail.com. And Alan, thank you again for being our guest, and I look forward to the next time we get a chance to talk about this.
Oh, I'd love to. It's been a great opportunity to spend some time with you and chat with your listeners. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you very much. May you and your listeners all be safe and well. Thank you. All
right. Thank you, Alan. And I tell our listeners, please join us again next week for Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. Thank you, and have a great week.